It's our pleasure here in ATIC to welcome all of you this afternoon with a series of our workshops that are co-conducted and co-organized with the World Bank. Today, we are fortunate to have with us Halsey Rogers and Shwetlana Sabarwal. They are leading economists in the World Bank, and they just have co-authored a paper which is titled The COVID-19 Pandemic, Shocks to Education and Policy Responses. We'll have them in about 45 minutes. In the start, with the first 20 minutes, Shwetlana will give an overview of the paper and some insights. Then after that, she will give the floor to the other speaker, and it will take about 20 minutes as well. So, Shwetlana, the floor is yours. Thank you for joining us. I think you are muted.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And welcome to everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here with you and to share our work with you. So as Doctor said, my name is Shwetlana and I am with the World Bank, and I co-authored this report with my colleague, Halsey Rogers. So let me start the presentation. So think back to November 2019. It seems such a long time ago, and such a better time, such a good time. But even back then, not everything was great. So in November 2019, around 270 million students were 270 million children were out of school. And globally, learning poverty, which is the share of children worldwide who could not read for meaning by age 10, was 53%. And then, as we all know, the world was hit by this COVID-19 pandemic. And overnight, almost all students were out of school. So at its peak, which happened sometime in May, late April, early May, 94% of students were out of school. And even now, when some systems have started to open, we find that nearly 65% of students are out of school. So this pandemic has touched many, many, many lives and really disrupted the education of millions of students around the world. Now, when we think about COVID-19's impact on education, this is what we focus on, right? So we really focus on the impact that these school closures will have on the education of students around the world. But one important point this report makes is that this is only one part of the story. The other part of the story is that we are also going to need to grapple with the impacts of the economic crisis. COVID-19 has created the potential for deep economic recession around the world. And we know from historical experience that this economic shock will also have an impact on education outcomes. And together, these impacts of the school closures and the impacts of the economic crisis could lead to permanent effects on the human capital, on the education outcomes of an entire generation, unless governments do something about it. So the way we've written this report and the way we are going to present today is in the first half, less than half, I'm going to talk through all the possible impacts that we are going to see through the current COVID-19 pandemic. And then I will hand over to my colleague, Halsey Rogers, who will talk through the policy implications. What is it that the governments can do, right? So please stay on. This is a presentation that highlights the problems, but also highlights the potential solutions. Okay, so starting first from school closures. Now, I think most of us, when we think of school closures, we think of the stop and the decline in academic learning, right? And this is unquestionable. Given that schools are closed for 3 months, 4 months, possibly longer in many education systems, we are going to see a decline in learning levels. Now, World Bank has done some simulation work to see how much decline are we going to see, right? And this work has just recently come out. It's really interesting. And we find that globally, the expected years of schooling adjusted for learning, right? So when you adjust schooling for learning, that will go down by more than half a year. So it will go down by 0.6 years. And in some ways, this is unprecedented, right? Because for the last few decades, we have only seen an increase in the expected years of schooling. And we are starting to see in many systems improvement in the quality of learning. And now we're going to go back in some ways and see a decline of 0.6 years. Another way to think about it is that the share of lower secondary students, right? So students who are in lower secondary grades, who don't meet minimum proficiencies, right, is going to increase by 25%. And this, again, is a really remarkable number. And all of this means that there will be lower learning and lower earning for these children, right? So in future, when these students join the labor force, they will not be as productive, they will not be earning as much as they could have earned without the COVID-19 pandemic. And it is estimated that for students who are in primary or secondary grades today, they will experience a drop in their lifetime earning of about 16,000 US dollars. This is massive. And if you aggregate these numbers, right, for all the students in the economy, economies around the world stand to lose trillions of dollars because of this pandemic, because of its impact on the education. Now, in addition to the impact we are going to see on learning levels, we are also going to see an impact on learning inequality, right? Now, as systems close, I think most parents hope that their children will continue to learn regardless. But the way that parents can support their children to continue learning varies very much depending on whether you are rich or you're not rich, right? So you can imagine rich parents can give their children a lot more in terms of resources, in terms of tools, computers, textbooks. They can also give them more in terms of potentially private tutoring. They can also give them more time, more attention. They don't have to include their children as much in doing household chores. So there's a lot that rich parents can do, which poor parents cannot do, right? So there is a huge digital divide. We know that only about 40% of people in developing world have access to internet, which is a huge predictor of how much remote learning you're able to access. Even in places like Latin America and Caribbean, we see there is a huge gap between the rich versus the poor, or in this case, only about 30% of poor families have access to computers versus 95% of rich families. So all of this means that we're going to see an increase in learning inequality. Now, as I said, learning is going to be impacted, but there are reasons to believe that it's not going to be impacted in the same way across all the grades, right? Now, we don't have clear data on this, but there are reasons to assume that certain grades or certain levels of schooling would be more deeply impacted than others, right? So one such level is early childhood education. Right? We all know that early childhood education is crucially important. It lays a foundation for all future learning. And this is a level of education where children cannot learn independently, right? So they need caregivers, they need people around them to help them learn. And in this crisis, that may not be possible. So there are some families for which early childhood education would be disproportionately impacted. The other level that may be impacted are the higher grades, right? So the upper secondary or the higher grades of lower secondary, because at this grade, the academic content gets so specialized that a lot of parents cannot help their children learn, right? So it's beyond the ability of a lot of parents to understand and help their children with this content. So this may also get disproportionately impacted. And finally, what all of this impact on learning means is that children who were already on the edge, right, children who were already at risk of potentially dropping out, may find these 3 or 4 months or longer of school closures to be just that shock that makes them drop out, that makes them fall over the edge and give up on schooling altogether. Now, as I said, when we think of school closures, we think of learning, right? But another aspect of school closures is that they are going to impact the health and safety of children. The most direct way in which this may happen is through the stopping of school feeding programs. So globally, like around the world, even in the richest countries, a lot of students depend on their school feeding programs to meet their daily nutritional needs. Okay? And with these programs stopping, the nutritional outcomes, the health outcomes of these children are likely to deteriorate. We may also see an increase in the vulnerability of students, right? So we know that for students in difficult and fragile situations, schools are sometimes the only safe haven they have, right? And schools provide them with an extra set of caretakers who can really see and intervene when a child is in trouble. So think of children in refugee camps, think of children in fragile or conflict-ridden families. So for those children, a huge safety net that they have with their school systems is now not going to be available to them. And even in the US, there has been some evidence that there is a drop in the reporting of abuse cases against children. And this is attributed to the fact that schools are closed. Another element of health and safety that is getting increased attention is that of mental health. So we now have some evidence to suggest that because of the pandemic, we are seeing increased susceptibility and increased rates of depression and anxiety among students around the world, right? And this is, again, not unexpected because we know that children are deeply affected by the world, by whatever is happening around them. So in this period of uncertainty, in this period of stress, children are also going to experience it. But because of school closures, they don't have access to a lot of support system. They don't have access to their peers, their friends. And so we are seeing an increase in depression and anxiety rates in places like China, Ecuador. We're possibly seeing them all over the world, but we have data about them increasingly from some countries. Okay, so turning now to the economic crisis. So we know we have a history of economic crisis, and we know what economic crises do to education outcomes. So here we have a little bit more data and empirical evidence. And we know that one of the first things that happens is that there is a fall in demand for education. So you can imagine that families that are now in a much more precarious economic condition may stop their children from going to school because they just don't have the money to spend on it, right? And usually we see that older children are targeted. In some societies, we see that girls in particular are vulnerable. So after the Ebola crisis, when schools reopened, it was found that girls, adolescent girls, were significantly less likely to be re-enrolled, right? And even if parents don't take their children out of school, they may still be spending less on education, right? So they may take their children out of a private school and put them in a public school, or they may start spending less on the child's learning materials and other support, right? So there's likely to be a fall in the demand for education. And what makes this worse is that we will also possibly see a corresponding fall in the supply of education and the quality of education. So the most direct way this happens is that government spending on education may get cut, right? Now, during the financial crisis of 2008, US spending on education declined significantly, okay? And this decline then meant that there was a decline in the quality of education, which led to a decline in high school graduation rates for the United States. So this is a very serious threat to education outcomes. As you can imagine, when you have cuts in education spending, quality may be affected, most likely will be affected. So for instance, one channel could be through teachers, right? So systems that were spending a lot on teacher training, on teacher skills development, professional development, if they cut that budget, then you're going to see possibly a decline in teacher skills, a decline in teacher motivation. You may also see an increase in teacher burnout, so education quality will suffer. However, this crisis is also kind of unprecedented in one way, that we are likely going to see a lot of closing of low-cost private schools, right? So recently, there's been a great increase in the supply of education through low-cost private schools, which serve these low middle-income families, right? But these private schools are often small. They're not operating with a lot of margin. So when this economic shutdown happened, when the school shutdowns happened and schools were closed for 3 to 4 months, a lot of these schools were not able to continue being financially viable, right? So we are going to see a collapse of a lot of low-cost private schools, which means that then the overall supply of education is falling, and these parents now have to rely on public education systems, which are, as it is, overcrowded and overstretched. Now, the point is that you have these, what we are thinking of as very short run and medium run shocks, right? School closures, economic crisis. And there is a tendency to believe that at some point we will come out of this and things will go back to normal. And hopefully that will happen. But one of the problems with education is that when you have short-term gaps, right, that are not remediated, right? So if learning is falling today and we are not doing anything to remediate that fall, then these gaps accumulate over time and turn into permanent long-run effects, okay? So if we don't intervene on these short to medium run effects now, they could very easily turn into long-run handicaps. So we see, for instance, that in Pakistan, there was a huge earthquake in 2005. And after about 4 months, schools reopened again, right? And again, the expectation was that things went back to normal. But what we actually found was that when schools reopened, after that, 4 years after that, these students were retested. And it was found that children who lived closest to the fault lines were 1.5 to 2 years behind academically than their counterparts who were not living close to the fault line of the earth. So these disadvantages, these gaps, they accumulate over time, and they will then lead to lower earnings, lower lifetime productivity, which will then harm the growth and development of the economy. And in this crisis, as in past crises, we've seen that there is an increase in learning inequality, which turns into an increase in economic inequality. And all of this together can cause a lot of instability, a lot of protest, a lot of unhappiness in our countries. So to summarize, we are going to see impacts of school closures in learning effects and health and safety effects. We are going to see the impacts of economic crisis, both in terms of a fall in demand for education and a fall in supply of education. And unless we do something, these would turn into long-run impacts that really threaten the growth, development, and stability of the economy around the world. This is such a bleak picture, but I want to now hand over to Halsey Rogers to show you that these are not inevitable, that by early and proactive government action, a lot of this can be avoided, and we have opportunities to do things better. So over to you, Halsey.
Great. Thank you, Svetlana. And let me join Svetlana in thanking our hosts for inviting us today and all of you for joining us. I would like to share my screen now. So could you please enable the sharing of screen? Great. I'm going to share the content. Sorry, give me 1 minute. So now the question, so Svetlana has laid out very well all the potential costs and the costs that we are seeing now. The question is, what can we do to prevent these twin shocks that she spoke of from doing this long-term damage? And we argue in the report that what is needed is 3 overlapping phases of response. The first phase, the phase we've been in up until now, is the coping phase. So while the schools are closed, there's a set of policies that we've needed to adopt to make sure that children are not suffering these immediate losses that Svetlana has talked about. The second phase is managing continuity as the schools begin to reopen. Then the third phase will be improving and accelerating, which has to continue well after the schools reopen, but should start now or should have already started. And I'm going to go through each of these in turn. Now, let me underline that the goal of all this should be to recover, but not to replicate the pre-COVID status quo. So Svetlana already spoke a bit about the learning crisis that we saw in the world before that. Some of you may have seen the World Development Report 2018 on learning to realize education's promise that Svetlana and I both worked on. And in that we laid out in detail what the characteristics of that pre-COVID status quo were. Not only did we have too many children and youth not in school, but those that were in school were learning far too little. There was very slow progress in improving that situation. And there were very high levels of inequality, and we see this around the world. So this is not what we want to return to as we rebuild and reopen schools. So we need to use this opportunity to build more effective, more inclusive, and more resilient education systems. Now, for the details, I hope you'll get a chance to look at the report, but in the next 20 minutes or so, I'd like to give you a flavor of that. So what is the response? How do we prevent that return to that pre-COVID status quo? Well, the coping policies, the immediate priority, of course, has been to protect the welfare and the learning and the potential of students during this crisis. That means first protecting health and safety of students. And we've seen this around the world. We've had hygiene campaigns to make people aware of what they need to do to prevent the spread of the pandemic. It's been important to reorient school feeding programs or replace them by cash transfers because of all the hundreds of millions of students who depended and their families who depended on school feeding programs, as Svetlana has discussed. Outreach to parents and students, and using the education resources, whether teachers or closed schools, to try to support these activities. And we've seen many of examples of this around the world. Secondly, of course, it's been crucial to keep students engaged in learning. It still is in the large majority of countries where schools are still closed. The key here is remote learning programs, of course. Before I get to that, I think we also want to make sure that we prevent dropout. But one of the key ways to do that is to make sure that students are still engaged in learning. Now, these remote learning programs are key, but they have to be implemented equitably so that all children and youth can participate. And we see countries doing this through creative multi-platform approaches that rely not just on online learning, because as we've seen in some countries, a small minority of students really have access to online learnings. So we're combining online in many countries with radio and TV, with SMS, with WhatsApp, with printed materials, and so on. And it's also been important to make sure, and it remains important to make sure, that parents and teachers are supported so that they can help students stay engaged, especially with these multi-platform approaches that often rely on a direct connection with the student in the home. And we're seeing a lot of creative solutions. Ministries are working with technology providers on these solutions. For example, in Kenya, we've seen to provide wider internet coverage to all students and families. We've seen the Kenyan Civil Aviation Authority, in partnership with Alphabet and Telecom Kenya, partner with Google's Loon balloon system. So they've set these balloons floating over Kenyan airspace to carry these 4G base stations through this network of stratospheric balloons that provide internet connectivity to rural and remote communities. And there we see that one balloon covers 80 square kilometers with connectivity. We also see governments working with telecom companies to provide free connectivity through zero rating systems. And in other countries like Peru, we are seeing the government providing tablets and computers to children in poor households, since often the problem is a lack of devices for accessing online resources. Now, I mentioned this multi-platform approach. Here's a nice example from the Edo Best program in Edo State of Nigeria. And you see this is the schedule for a typical day of learning. You see that early in the day, it starts with connection through WhatsApp or the web for those who have it, with activity packs distributed in that way, and children working in the activity packs. Then you have a radio lesson. Then you have a digitally distributed lesson guide where a family member needs to direct the lesson. Then you have WhatsApp again with the student interacting with the teacher. And then quizzes through WhatsApp. And finally, independent reading through storybooks that have been distributed to households. So they're working very hard to make sure that no child falls between the cracks. Third, it's important to draw on tertiary education systems. Now, we're going to be emphasizing, and we've been emphasizing, the primary, pre-primary, primary, and secondary education in this presentation, but it's crucial to recognize, of course, that the hundreds of millions of post-secondary students are affected as well. And many of the same issues and then many of the same solutions that relate to school education are also applying to tertiary. And here we need to recognize that tertiary can also play a major role in coping and recovery. The tertiary institutions are connecting countries with the knowledge and learning from around the world. They are often devising creative solutions to, for example, shortages of personal protective equipment and trying to figure out how to get that scaled up and distributed around country. We also see training of health workers and other emergency workers. So the tertiary plays a very important role here. Now, the second phase is managing continuity as schools reopen. And here, the goal is to ensure health and safety again, but also to narrow and especially to narrow the learning gaps that have emerged and widened during the crisis. This means that we have to rebuild all of the pillars of a strong education system. Before I get into that, let me emphasize that reopening of schools may not be a one-time process. We're seeing schools reopen in a staggered ways, often by level or grade. We also see in some countries cycles of reclosing as the pandemic surges again. So schools have to be logistically prepared for that, for the reopening with the teaching workforce ready, but they also have to be ready to shift again to blended learning if necessary, if they close again, and there has to be financing available for all of this. Now, what are the key pillars, the 5 pillars of a strong education system? Well, you need prepared learners first, you need safe and inclusive schools, you need classrooms equipped for learning, you need supported teachers, and you need good management. Let me go through each of those in turn. First, prepared learners. Obviously, this is key. We have to bring students back to school and prepare them. That can mean re-enrollment drives and campaigns to make sure that we don't lose anybody, that we don't have a dropout, especially for the students who have not been able to be as engaged during the school closing. And that includes really identifying the most at-risk students and then providing targeted scholarships or tuition support or subsidies to get them back in. And school feeding programs will also help to attract students back. Secondly, the schools have to be safe and inclusive. And obviously that's a key here, these enhanced sanitation and health protocols. We may need logistics, as I mentioned, like staggered shifts, where some students come back for 1 week, the other students come back for the next week, or shifts within a day in order to minimize contact. And counseling where necessary. And without this, I think parents often won't trust the system enough to send their children back to school. And then teachers, many of whom are in these high-risk demographic groups because they're older or have comorbidities, they may not be willing to return either. And so it's key to focus on that. And now we're seeing lots of different approaches to this around the world, but they involve a lot of similar strategies, including, for example, staggered reopenings, these very strict social distancing practices and sanitation protocols. And we're seeing quite a number of those. We've seen some in Northern Europe and in East Asia now that we can learn from. One point before I move on. What happens when schools reopen? And here, the science is constantly evolving. We saw a good presentation from our health colleagues at the World Bank last week, where they presented some information on this. And what we're seeing overall is that in most countries, we don't see a surge in cases right after schools reopening. However, there are exceptions. You see, for example, here, Madagascar, the red line, there was a surge, now albeit from a very low base. But that, and we've also seen in Israel, for example, reopening of schools just to spark part of an increase of a pandemic in some areas, so that they then had to reclose some schools. So it's very important to learn from those experiences and monitor it carefully to make sure that things are still under control. Third, classrooms have to be equipped for learning, and this is crucial. This is something that could be missed. We have to be very clear on the likely large learning losses that will be seen for some students, especially for the most disadvantaged. And so here, the emphasis needs to be on teaching at the right level. So that means we need very good formative assessments to gauge how far students have fallen behind during COVID. And then we need curriculum and pedagogy that's really focused on the greatest learning needs, especially in the core areas. And that's going to be very much the foundational and literacy skills, especially for the youngest children, where there's been a window of opportunity for them to learn. And we want to make sure to capture that so that they don't have the losses and they don't fall further and further behind the curriculum as instruction proceeds. And that may mean, for example, adjusting the academic calendar to allow makeup and learning time, but it definitely means focusing the curriculum in many cases. We see this, for example, in China. We've seen individualized remediation plans for students with disadvantaged backgrounds. That's going to be necessary in most settings. Fourth, of course, effective valued teachers. Here, really, for teachers to play the crucial role that we're asking of them, they need to be trained, given practical training, whether in assessment techniques, in teaching at the right level, in figuring out what part of the curriculum they should be prioritizing while making up learning. And of course, being able to identify at-risk students is key, because if there have been big learning losses, then the students who have lost the most are most likely then to drop out in the months after school is reopened. And we've seen teaching at the right level interventions in the pre-COVID period that have resulted in very large learning gains. So there's a lot we can learn from there. Fifth, all this needs well-managed systems. So the systems need to prioritize greater equity and better outcomes. This means using data and monitoring very effectively because in what's going to be a very rapidly changing environment, both on the learning front, but also on the health front. It also means scanning for what innovations in learning recovery are most effective in different parts of the system, and then scaling those up. And of course, financing is going to be crucial for all of this. At a time when budgets are going to be hit, it's very important to make sure there's enough financing equitably distributed. This takes us to the third and final phase, which is improving and accelerating. Here, again, we have to seize these opportunities to make education more effective, inclusive, and resilient than it was before COVID. And we can achieve this by building on the new awareness of what must change. There should be greater awareness now of the need to close the digital divide and also the non-digital divide, to build teachers' digital skills, to involve families more in learning going forward, and to focus curriculums and pedagogy. Now, this phase should start now, but it needs to continue well after school is reopened. Many of the same policies, and this is crucial, that will be essential to learning recovery will also make education systems stronger and more effective if we can scale them up, if we can sustain them and scale them up in the months and years to come. This includes, as I mentioned, teaching at the right level, figuring out where each student is situated in terms of learning, and then meeting their needs. It also includes curriculum that focuses enough on foundational skills for all students, which is a problem we see in many countries, overambitious curricula that will now prove to be even more ambitious with these learning losses. It means we need teachers that can assess learning gaps and are empowered with effective techniques to close those gaps. And then it includes more effective uses of technology than we've seen in the past. And here we've learned better what works. We've gotten more children connected in many different ways. So this should really be possible. But that's not sorry, let me give one example of that. It's actually possible to turn the recovery strategies into long-term improvement. Let me emphasize this with some examples. So a colleague of ours, Michelle Kaffenberger at the Center for Global Development, has done some simulations to show what happens. And this makes the point that Svetlana made, that if you have a short-term shock, it can lead to even bigger long-term losses in learning. This gives a simulation that shows that if grade 3 learning has been reduced by half during this pandemic, it is likely that this learning loss will grow over time. And even after these students return to school, we'll see bigger learning losses, so that by grade 10, the typical student will have lost a year and a half worth of learning. But these same simulations emphasize what can happen if we have strong, well-targeted recovery strategies that emphasize remediation, that emphasize effective assessment, that emphasize focusing of the curriculum. It estimates that even with this large shock, we can end up with students in grade 10 who are actually have more than an additional year's worth of learning because of the more effective remediation techniques and curriculum focusing. So it's really crucial that we take that opportunity. But that's not enough. We also need to reinforce these changes by building back better. We want to emphasize this building back better with system reforms that will support all these changes. For example, again, assessment and curriculum adjustments to high stakes examinations can help by focusing much more on the types of assessment that are effective in promoting learning, including more effective formative assessment, but also summative assessment that encourages the development of the learning and skills that we really want to see in students. Curriculum simplification, that's not going to be done in the middle of a crisis, but can be done in a sustained way afterward. We need more effective data systems so that we can track what students are doing, how they're learning, better technology for system management. Again, very hard to do in an emergency response setting, but we need to do that over time. And then, of course, what's now become obvious to all of us, I think, is that we need to invest more in the long-term resilience of both the systems, the schools, and the students. Finally, and I'll close with this, there has to be enough financing to support this recovery and improvement. This means safeguarding the financing now in this time of great fiscal strain that we're going to see in many countries, but it also means focusing what financing there is more on the front lines, on the areas of greatest need, including the children and youth with the greatest need. And then focusing on the programs that have proven most effective as we've been monitoring and assessing what's going on. So as countries move through these three phases, they have a real opportunity to build back better and to use the most effective crisis recovery strategies as a basis for long-term improvements. They and we should seize this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This is wonderful. Thank you, Svetlana. Thank you, Halsey. I think it's a well-focused presentation, and you delivered the message very well. Thank you. Just 2 comments. I put on the chat 2 links, one to the original paper that this presentation is based on, and the other paper that you mentioned, learning to realize the education's promise. So if there is anyone who is interested in looking into the papers, so they are there. Another comment, just to highlight that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the Ministry of Education here in Saudi Arabia, had invested a lot on the digital platforms. So when the pandemic started, they provided 19 TV satellites for all students. So there is one separate satellite for each grade, and with the higher secondary education, they provided, even with the different tracks, there is one single satellite for every track in the secondary education. Then they provided a YouTube channel. They provided 3 different platforms. One of them is just dedicated to the digital content and items bank to assist students. There was a lot of work, actually. Our concern is on the part of engagement of the students. It's not clear if they have benefited from this. It's not clear about the engagement of the teacher as well. So ETIC now is conducting a massive study to follow up with the students, parents, teacher, with the interviews, surveys, and first-hand evaluation of the platforms. We hope in the next few months they will publish this study. So we have first question. It's saying reports. I'm not sure you see the question. It's to you, Svetlana. Svetlana, it's a question for you in the chat. I'm not sure if you can see it. Okay. So report studies have shown that the most affected groups are the early grades. How can teachers help these students and reduce the learning loss when the new academic year starts?
Great, thank you. I wasn't able to see the question, so thank you for mentioning it. So I just want to clarify that this idea that early childhood may be disproportionately affected, I mean, this is something that theoretically seems plausible. I haven't seen an actual study showing this, but this is a cause for concern because as most of us know, early childhood is a very foundational stage for learning. So I'll try to answer, but I welcome Halsey also to chime in, as you know, we wrote this together. So the idea here is that in early grades, even though children need attention, they can learn in a variety of ways, right? So there isn't a lot that is required, right? What is required is stimulation. What's required is play-based learning. What's required is reading to the child, singing to the child. So, you know, basically things that people can do very easily. So even when schools are closed, I think if governments are able to communicate with parents and caregivers through messages, through pamphlets, through TV messaging about strategies that they can use, which are, again, as I said, very simple: play with your child for 1 hour a day, read to your child, things like that, then I think this gap can be reduced quite a bit. And then, you know, when children come back, I think, again, the idea is to follow evidence-based strategies on how to learn for early grades. And there's a lot of good evidence now. More and more, the evidence is showing that it should be play-based. It should not be very structured. It should be designed to build their socio-emotional skills and their team playing with each other skills, and so on and so forth. So the two big ideas are be in touch with parents. A lot of times parents don't realize, they think if the child is less than 6 years old, less than 5 years old, they don't need that much stimulation or attention, but they do for learning activities. And then the second idea is to then, when schools reopen, really rapidly train teachers in evidence-based strategies on how to do it. The most important thing would be not to put pressure on children, the children at this stage should not be pressured into meeting some type of learning milestones, but rather supported in a very constructive way. Halsey, anything you want to add?
Yes, thank you. I think Svetlana, I think, has covered nicely the early childhood. So how to think about the children up to age 6 or 7. Then the question is more the early grades. How do we, because that's also an area that we're very concerned about. And the reason for that is precisely because of these foundational literacy and numeracy skills that children should be acquiring, for example, up through by about 4th grade. The question is, what has happened to them? And here we want to make sure not to miss this window where curricula assume that children are going to be acquiring these skills, because we've seen what's happened in many, many countries just in normal times when you don't have school closures for months. We see how many children simply fail to acquire these basic foundational skills. I mean, Svetlana quoted just at the beginning, for those of you who may not have joined yet, that the 53% learning poverty rate for the low and middle income countries, meaning of 10-year-olds around the world, 53% don't have basic literacy, can't understand a short passage by of 10-year-olds. So that's more than half. And we have even bigger gaps in numeracy. So this is likely to have gotten much worse. And the question is, how do you close that? And here we've learned a lot in recent years about this, the advantages of really focusing the curriculum enough to make sure that all children acquire these skills before you move on, having good learning materials in the appropriate languages that the children can understand, having teachers who are really practically trained in assessing these skills and knowing how to close learning gaps, not with a lot of theoretical training, but actual practical skills. And we have now very good examples of that from around the world. And that's really what countries need to be doing in this period after schools reopen. Thanks.
Thank you, Halsey. A question for you, Halsey. Would you please, expand and specify the technique of refocusing the curriculum? So do you have in mind any model or steps that could be of use and help for curriculum developers or teachers to use them to refocus the curriculum? Thank you.
Thank you. I think one key is just to know what children are learning and are not learning before you even take that step. And so good assessment is very important. I think once you do the assessments, it's going to be pretty clear where there are gaps in the most core foundational literacy and numeracy skills that are the foundation for all subsequent learning. If it's clear that students are not even acquiring those, and yet the curriculum includes lots of add-ons that are desirable, that we all think are very desirable, but that really depend on having those foundational literacy and numeracy skills, then that will give you a sense of sort of what to at least temporarily prune or streamline so you can focus in on what's most needed. And there are examples where we can see. I had the pleasure of going to the state of Ceará in Brazil in February, just before everybody stopped traveling. And we were able to spend a week understanding what's going on in that state and the municipality of Sobral. These are places that in very challenging circumstances and quite in a relatively poor region of Brazil have achieved the best results in all of Brazil in terms of foundational literacy and numeracy, despite having started 20 years ago from a very low base. And you can learn a lot just by looking at what they're doing in terms of all of the areas I just mentioned. The teachers are well trained in and very enthusiastic about formative assessment, but they're also very careful to focus the curriculum on the skills that they regard as most important. And so we can learn a lot by looking at those cases and seeing what they do. And just to advertise another report, actually our colleagues in the Brazil office are coming out with a series of reports on this experience that will include in part a focus on this curriculum focusing and streamlining. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Halsey. Shwetlina, there is a question for you. There are, in thinking of this pandemic, two sides. One side that is, the policymakers and the educational leaders, they are thinking about the learning loss. On the other side, parents, they are thinking about the emotional, consequences of the pandemic, and they are concerned of sending their children back to the school, whether school have started yet or in the new academic year. So to relieve parents to send back their children to school, what do you recommend and suggest that the educational institutions they can do to communicate with parents?
So thank you so much. So this is a great question, and I think most systems around the world are still grappling with it. And one good thing is that we can learn a lot from the systems that are currently opening. And I think, as Halsey mentioned, some systems have been able to open relatively smoothly, and some systems have really struggled. So I think looking at their experiences helps. So I will again invite Halsey to come in, but my sense is that the biggest thing that schools can do and that systems can do to bring children back is to put in place really stringent, really evidence-based strategies for hygiene, for preventing, further outbreaks, right? And those strategies that schools have to put in place are now pretty codified, right? So we know from medical professionals what it is that a system has to do, what is it that a group has to do to make sure that they are safe, relatively safe. I think the other part is to not be too ambitious about reopening, to think about reopening in stages, to think about reopening in staggered ways, to think about getting children into school maybe 2 days a week, 3 days a week instead of the full shot. And the final third point that I would say, and that Halsey can add, is to communicate with parents, right? So put in place health and safety guidelines, put in place everything that you can, be very, very particular. Second, try to think about opening in phases in staggered fashion. And third, to communicate to parents, to show them exactly what it is that the school is doing and what it is that the parents have to do and what it is that the child has to do. So, creating a sense of shared responsibility and transparent communication is really important. Halsey, anything you want to add?
Yeah, no, very well said. I would just add, so that I think that's exactly right in terms of the strategies. One of the things to communicate as the science gets better is that it should be feasible to reopen these schools in a safe and healthy way. And we're seeing more and more examples of that. As I mentioned before, I think one of the advantages of working at the World Bank is that we have very gifted and knowledgeable health colleagues. And so I learned a lot in this presentation that I was able to see last week about that. And I'm just pulling it up now. And just to quote some of the headlines from that presentation, and you may know all this, but I found it very helpful to see all of this data assembled. So 1 point, children of all ages get COVID-19, but they are far less commonly infected than adults. So as far as we can tell, they're lower infection rates. The vast majority of them do not get severe disease, as you know. What's also interesting, and here there is less data, but what data there is somewhat encouraging, that children rarely infect teachers when schools do reopen. And they've done this, they've been able to do tracking and tracing. And for example, they put together a set of studies from a number of countries with specific incidents. They find only one case where a student infected a teacher after being infected, him or herself. And the children rarely infect parents as well. And there are a variety of physiological, biomedical reasons why this should be the case. And obviously, it's not at all a reason to let down our guard. I think Svetlana has laid out the procedures very carefully, and these are very important. But what that's to say is that we may be able to communicate, especially as the science gets better, that this is not as big a risk as we originally thought.
Thank you. Halsey, two questions to the investors of private education here in Saudi Arabia. The educational investors in the private schools here in Saudi Arabia, they share the cost with the government. So do you think that the investors will be less motivated to stay in education markets and they will look around for another investment opportunity? Another question related to this, to you, Halsey, as well. How can, to prevent that, how can the government reassure the investors and strike a balance between increasing the fees on parents and helping them to stay in the market?
Thank you for those questions. I think this is a risk that Svetlana spoke about, which is we are concerned, particularly with some of the low-cost private schools with very low margins in the poorer countries, that they may have been forced to exit during the school closures. I would guess this will be less of a risk in some of the wealthier countries. I think in the long term, clearly, there's not going to be any big change in the long term on demand for education. This should be more of a short-term shock to education. Obviously, it depends how deep the global recession is in the months and years to come. Under the worst scenarios, clearly there could be a big issue with declining demand, and some schools will close. And perhaps that will be necessary to a point, because clearly the demand for schools is going to be a function and should be a function of what societies can afford for private schools. Now, so government's first goal and primary goal is really to make sure that all students have access to a quality education. So if some private schools close, it's going to be necessary for then government to make sure that public schools can handle the surge in supply. However, of course, we don't want there to be short-term shocks that have long-term consequences. If it looks like demand should recover in the months and years to come relatively quickly, then it certainly makes sense for government to think about some kind of bridge financing or other tools to try to keep the private schools going so that we don't lose a lot of organizational capital, a lot of built up relationships, and have those broken for just a short-term shock. So it's really about striking a balance, continuing to monitor the state of the economy and the state of demand, and then having the policies meet that local context. Svetlana, would you like to add anything on that?
No, I think you covered it really well. And again, I think the importance of communication, right? So I understand that there's a lot of uncertainty, but I think what education systems can do to kind of, if they have a sense of vision, if they have a sense of what they want to do in the future, communicate that to stakeholders. That would be really great.
My colleague Mohammed Al-Khairi, I think he has a question. He is raising his hand. Dr. Mohammed, if you could, shall I allow you to speak? I'm not sure. If you can access the mic, please do. And okay, so I have a couple of questions to conclude our, webinar. One of them, it's to you, Svetlana. So you mentioned 3 times in your presentations, the concern of data. You said, according to available data, there is no clear data. We haven't had yet the data. So ETIC is a governmental body that, collecting data, and our studies here, data, we cannot do our studies without clear and timely data. So any recommendations in terms of, collecting and, gathering data and generating data for this, studies related to the pandemic?
Thank you so much, Doctor. So I think, again, in my view, there are 3 things that come to mind, but again, I welcome Halsey to come in as well. So the first thing, of course, is the health information, right? So clearly COVID, the best strategies for avoiding proliferation of cases is track and trace, is to really make sure that if you have any cases, you're able to track them. So I think the basic data, it has to be on monitoring the health of students and teachers and the system as a whole. The second thing is related to what Halsey mentioned, which is the idea of doing quick formative assessments to inform us about whether, to what extent has the crisis affected students, what are the learning lags that we are seeing, and what are the areas where remediation is needed, right? And here, I think the idea is to look beyond the average, to look at the gaps, the lower tail of the distribution, the upper tail of the distribution, and then maybe try to think about whether we need to rethink how we group students so that we can provide more targeted instruction to help them catch up. So that's the second type of data on formative assessments. The third type of data that I think will be very important is on, well, now I've thought of 4. So the third type of data will be on how are we channeling resources, how are we channeling, what is the current state of quality? So what are the teachers experiencing? What are the students experiencing? Who needs more help, basically? Data on, where are their supply shortfalls and where can we provide more targeted support? And the fourth one, which is a little bit more ambiguous, but I think is going to be really important, is to make sure that we are documenting what different actors are doing to improve the situation. So I think, one big opportunity we have is to learn from the innovations that have happened during this very unprecedented time, right? So we have actors who have responded to this crisis through innovation, through new ideas, and it's very important to capture what those innovations were, what the impacts of those innovations were, and how can we scale them up. So these are the 4 ideas I have. Halsey?
Yeah, I think, Svetlana, you've covered it very well. Just to elaborate on one point, which is this notion of sort of getting qualitative data on the teachers. We need to focus in on their social-emotional well-being. This is going to be a very challenging time for them, and of course also for the students. But with the teachers, we need to be tracking burnout. We need to make sure that there's some kind of help desk that they can reach out to, whether for counseling or for practical strategies in the classroom. And we see some countries setting these up. And so that will be very important so that the teachers know they're not in this alone, that they have support.
Thank you. Our final question to you, Halsey. Are there any estimates of the cost of maintaining schools safe and in good shape of health? So any estimates from other countries or studies? It seems that there are estimates of learning loss. What about the estimate of the cost of maintaining schools safe and healthy?
That's a very good question. I don't think I've seen good estimates on that. I think we can think about what the costs are likely to be. And if we're sort of using the same teaching force, for example, but we have staggered shifts or we have alternating weeks, the cost in terms of financial resources may not be great if those are some of the primary interventions. The cost will more likely be in terms of learning. It's going to be much harder to maintain the learning of children if they're only in school, for example, every other week, or if they're only in school half the day because of staggered shifts to reduce the density. So we have to be very careful about the cost, and as Svetlana said, be tracking the cost in terms of learning. In terms of the outlays, there will be certainly additional outlays for things like protective equipment, for deep cleaning of schools, et cetera. I haven't seen estimates. I don't know if Svetlana has, but those are likely to be less big than the cost in terms of learning, I think. But Svetlana, have you seen anything on that?
No, I haven't, but I think we can sort of start to think about systems that have recently reopened and maybe start a dialogue about sharing some of their information.
Indeed.
Thank you very much. Any final words before I conclude the session? Halsey or Shwetlina, if you have any final words.
Sure, just to thank you all for all the work you're doing, and that we are here to serve as your partners in trying to make sure to prevent these learning losses and turn this into an opportunity for building back better. I know to that end, I understand that two of our colleagues, Juan and Melissa, will be presenting to you next week on a framework for reopening schools, and I highly recommend that if you're able to attend. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, everybody. This has been such a pleasure. And, I think the thing to leave you with is the positive message that we can use this as an opportunity. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much. What's a wonderful presentation. On behalf of ETIC and on behalf of all participants, I thank you, Shwetlina and Halsey, for all, the information, well-informed presentation. There are, many takeaways to focus on here in Saudi Arabia. We have, this fruitful partnership with the World Bank, whether in these webinars or the studies that we are conducting here with the World Bank in ETIC for the benefit of Saudi Arabia. So thank you again, and we look forward to the next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Skibi. Thank you all.
Thank you.